Sarah Mitchell had always believed in power. Power in her words, power in her mind, power in the way she commanded a room filled with men twice her age and twice as arrogant. She had built tech vision solutions from nothing but a laptop, a determination that burned brighter than pain, and a refusal to let pity ever touch her. The wheelchair that carried her body had become both armor and throne, a reminder of her accident, and a declaration that nothing, no broken bone, no shattered dream, could hold her back from creating the empire she envisioned. To investors, she was steel and fire. To competitors, she was the storm that could not be contained. And yet, on this evening, surrounded by roses and champagne laughter, she felt small in ways she had not felt for years. The riverside gardens glowed under strings of fairy lights, the September air carrying the faint scent of white roses mixed with freshly cut grass. Her younger sister Emily was the star of the night, radiant in silk and lace, moving like a dream across the dance floor. Guests circled her in admiration, their voices warm, their hands always reaching, their faces full of joy. Sarah sat at table 12, pushed slightly into the corner where shadows softened her edges, where she could observe without being observed. The tablecloth draped over her knees, hiding the wheels of her chair, as if some kind soul had thought she might prefer to disappear into anonymity. And perhaps tonight she did. The string quartet played a soft waltz, each note weaving itself into the golden twilight. Couples swayed together in a rhythm that looked effortless, their bodies speaking the language of music and love. Sarah's eyes followed them, not with envy, but with something heavier, something more fragile, a longing she had buried deep beneath layers of schedules, contracts, and late-night emails. The longing to be part of something tender, the longing to be held not because of duty or admiration, but simply because someone wanted her close. She tried to smile when familiar relatives stopped by. She asked about children she had never met, complimented dresses she barely noticed, and accepted praise for accomplishments that felt hollow in the face of this celebration. For in the quiet folds of her heart, she knew she had traded intimacy for security, warmth for control. And the silence of her life, once peaceful, now pressed down on her chest like an ache that would not heal. Her phone buzzed against her purse, pulling her instinctively into the comfort of work. She opened emails with practiced ease, letting the numbers and charts distract her from the music, from the laughter, from the ache in her ribs that whispered of what she no longer had. The glow of the screen shielded her like armor. Here, in the language of profits and losses, she was safe. No one could touch her. "Miss, are those wheels heavy?" The small voice pierced her concentration, bright and curious. Sarah looked up. A boy, perhaps 8 years old, stood before her. His white shirt was damp and stained with pink punch, his eyes wide and unafraid. Behind him, a tall man hovered, apology written across his face, hands calloused and awkward at his sides. Sarah blinked, startled. Most adults looked at her with polite discomfort, careful not to say the wrong thing, careful not to see too much. But this child... He looked at her chair as if it were a marvel, not a prison. He looked at her as though she were whole, complete, and interesting. "They're not too heavy," Sarah said, her lips curving into a smile she hadn't planned. Her voice softened, as though speaking to this child required a gentler register. "But they're strong. Want to see?" Before the man could stop him, the boy nodded eagerly. Sarah spun her chair in a practice circle, smooth and effortless, the movement one she had once rehearsed in secret, desperate to reclaim some control over her body. The boy clapped with delight, his laughter ringing like bells. "That's so cool! Do it again!" "Jake," the man interrupted, his voice half stern, half tender. He stepped closer, his broad shoulders filling Sarah's vision. His hair was a sandy brown, his jaw strong yet softened by weariness. His eyes, though, stopped her. They carried no pity, only kindness, and something deeper, a guardedness born from his own sorrows. "I'm sorry about him. He asks too many questions." Sarah extended her hand, still smiling, her heart unexpectedly lighter. "Sarah Mitchell." He took her hand. His grip was warm, firm, steady. "David Harrison, and this is my son, Jake." The boy grinned proudly. For a moment, Sarah forgot the hum of music, forgot the clinking glasses, forgot the polite stares she had grown used to. The world narrowed to this man, his son, and the simple honesty of their presence. And deep inside, in a place she rarely allowed herself to touch, something stirred, a flicker of healing, fragile but real, like the first warmth of dawn after a long, cold night. Sarah's gaze drifted back toward the dance floor. Couples still moved as though they had been born to music, effortless and whole. Her chest tightened. She had told herself many times that dancing was something she would never do again. That part of her life had ended on the day her legs refused to carry her. But now, with David standing beside her and Jake looking at her with unfiltered admiration, she wondered if perhaps she had been wrong. Because maybe dancing was not only about steps or rhythm, maybe it was about presence, connection, and the courage to let someone close enough to share your weight. For years, Sarah had believed she was strong because she carried everything alone. But tonight, as the music swelled and David's quiet eyes met hers, she began to wonder if true strength might be found in letting someone else carry a little of it with her. And in that wondering, she felt a soft wave wash through her, a wave of something she had not felt in so long that she almost didn't recognize it: hope. The music shifted into another waltz, the notes weaving through the air like ribbons of light, and Sarah found herself caught between the glow of the dance floor and the grounded presence of the father and son beside her. For years, she had felt like an observer of joy rather than a participant. Yet something about this small interruption, this boy with his honest questions and his father with his steady gaze, had shifted the rhythm of the evening. David lingered, his hand still resting lightly against the back of his son's chair. He seemed uncertain, as though unsure if he had intruded too far into her solitude. But there was a warmth in his hesitation, not the polished caution of corporate men, but the carefulness of someone who had learned the weight of loss and the fragility of hearts. Sarah could sense it, the way he measured his words, the way his body held both strength and restraint. "You don't mind him asking?" David said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Not at all," Sarah replied. Her smile softened into something she hadn't worn in years, unguarded, real. "Most adults tiptoe around me, afraid to say the wrong thing. But he just asks, and that feels more healing than you realize." David's eyes flickered, a shadow of gratitude mingling with something unspoken. He looked down at Jake, who was now inspecting the shiny wheels of Sarah's chair as if they were treasures. "He has a way of cutting through things," David admitted, "sometimes too much. But I suppose that's the gift of being 8. You don't know yet what you're supposed to keep hidden." Sarah's throat tightened, though not with sadness. There was truth in his words, and in that truth lay a gentleness that felt like balm over old wounds. For years she had lived behind polished speeches and perfected defenses. Tonight, a child's blunt honesty felt like sunlight breaking through cracks she had thought would never open again. Jake looked up suddenly, his eyes alight with curiosity. "Do you like cake?" he asked, as though this were the most important question in the world. Sarah laughed, the sound surprising her as much as anyone else. "I suppose I do." "Good," Jake said firmly, "because Dad says cake is for celebrating, and you look like you need to celebrate something." The boy's words landed with the force of a truth she had not admitted to herself. She did need to celebrate something. She needed to remember that life was not only measured in quarterly earnings or contracts signed, but in laughter and sweetness and the company of those who saw her not as a symbol or a leader, but simply as Sarah. David cleared his throat, clearly flustered by his son's directness. "Jake," he murmured, "why don't you slow down a little?" But Sarah shook her head, her smile warm. "It's all right. He's right, actually. I could use a reason to celebrate." She let her eyes meet David's then, steady and searching. "And sometimes the best reasons come when you least expect them." For a long moment, the world seemed to hush around them. The laughter from the bar, the music from the quartet, even the clinking of glasses. All of it faded into the background as she held his gaze. His eyes were not polished or guarded the way she was used to. They were open in their weariness, strong in their vulnerability, and something inside her shifted. It was as though she had stumbled upon a piece of herself she had lost, the part that still longed for connection, for belonging, for love that healed rather than demanded. Jake tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, ask her," he whispered loudly enough that Sarah caught every word. David's jaw tightened, embarrassment flickering across his features. "We talked about this, buddy." "But you said you'd ask," Jake insisted, his voice ringing with the stubborn certainty of a child who believed the world should bend toward honesty. "And she looks nice." And she smiled. Sarah felt her cheeks warm, not with discomfort, but with the tender shock of being seen. She turned her attention back to David, waiting. His face held the war between pride and hesitation, between the scars of old grief and the fragile hope of something new. Finally, with a quiet breath, he spoke. "Would you—" His voice faltered, then steadied. "Would you like to dance?" The question hung between them, fragile and luminous. Sarah's chest tightened with both fear and longing. She had told herself many times that dancing was lost to her, locked away with the use of her legs. And yet, here was a man who asked not with pity, not with condescension, but with sincerity. He did not see her as broken. He saw her as a woman who deserved to be on the dance floor, even if it looked different than anyone else's. Her heart whispered yes long before her lips formed the word. "I'd love to." Jake whooped with delight, drawing the attention of several nearby guests. "See, Dad, I told you." David's smile spread slowly, like sunlight warming a cold room. He extended his hand toward her, steady and sure, and in that gesture was more healing than any polished speech or carefully chosen compliment. It was the offering of companionship, the promise of presence, the beginning of something she had not dared hope for. As Sarah placed her hand in his, she felt the tremor of anticipation ripple through her chest. For 3 years she had carried loneliness like armor. But tonight, with this man's hand holding hers and his son's laughter ringing in the air, she allowed herself to believe that healing might not come in solitude, but in the courage to reach back. And as he guided her toward the dance floor, every eye turning in quiet wonder, Sarah realized that perhaps the evening was not about her sister's happiness alone. Perhaps, just perhaps, it was the beginning of her own. The dance floor stretched before her like uncharted territory, glowing under soft strands of golden light. For years, Sarah had sat at the edge of moments like this, watching, observing, convincing herself she no longer belonged to the world of music and rhythm. But tonight was different. Tonight, a calloused hand held hers, a small boy darted ahead like a beacon, and the music seemed to whisper that perhaps belonging was not lost, only waiting. David guided her chair gently, his movements careful, as though he understood the enormity of what he was asking of her. "Are you ready?" he asked softly, his voice carrying both patience and hope. Sarah's heart thudded against her ribs. The truth was, she wasn't ready. She hadn't been ready for 3 years, ready to be seen, ready to take a chance, ready to risk breaking open the walls she had built so tightly around herself. But she looked into his eyes, into that quiet strength that seemed both worn and healing, and realized that readiness was not the point. Courage was. "Yes," she whispered. The music swelled around them, violins and cellos, weaving a melody that felt like memory itself. David moved behind her chair, his hands resting lightly on the handles, waiting for permission. She gave a small nod, and then he began to move. At first it was slow, circles in time with the music, gentle sways that mirrored the rhythm of couples nearby. Sarah felt her breath catch, not from fear, but from wonder. She had expected awkwardness, pity disguised as gallantry. Instead, what she felt was partnership. Every turn was attuned to her, every step taken with consideration, not hesitation. He was not dragging her into his world, he was stepping into hers. It was not a dance in the traditional sense, but it was theirs. And as he spun her chair in a graceful arc, Sarah felt something loosen inside her chest, something that had been bound tight since the accident. For the first time in years, she was not defined by the stillness of her legs, but by the movement of her heart. "This is nice," she murmured, her voice unsteady with emotion. David leaned slightly closer, his breath brushing against her ear. "You make it easy," he said. "You move like music." The words sank into her like sunlight through clouds, warming places she had long kept cold. Her eyes blurred, but the tears that gathered were not heavy with sorrow. They carried something gentler, more healing, like rain that coaxes blossoms from the earth after a long drought. Jake, unable to contain his excitement, darted around them like a small comet. "Faster, Dad! Do the spinny thing again!" he cried. His laughter rang like bells, pulling smiles from the guests who paused to watch. Sarah laughed too, the sound bubbling up from deep inside her. She hadn't realized how much she had missed this. Laughter that wasn't polished for cameras or clipped for professionalism, but wild and unguarded. For a heartbeat, she felt weightless, as though she really could fly. The other couples began to notice. Conversations quieted, eyes turned. But for once, Sarah did not shrink under the attention. The way David moved with her, the way Jake cheered them on, turned what could have been spectacle into something beautiful. People were not staring in pity. They were witnessing joy. "You're drawing an audience," she teased, breathless. "Good," David replied, his tone firm, his eyes never leaving hers. "Let them see how beautiful this is. Let them see how beautiful you are." The words struck her like a gentle shock, as though her heart had forgotten the shape of such honesty. When had someone last said she was beautiful, not as a polite courtesy, but as truth? She could not remember. And yet here was this man, whose life had been carved by grief, speaking to her as though she were not broken, not diminished, but radiant. Her throat tightened, but she managed to whisper, "Thank you for making me feel like myself again." David slowed their movement, crouching slightly so his eyes were level with hers. His face was flushed, his hair disheveled from the exertion, but his gaze was steady. "This isn't me doing you a kindness, Sarah. This is me being selfish, because I haven't felt this alive in a long time. And you remind me what that feels like." The honesty undid her. For so long, she had carried loneliness like armor, mistaking solitude for strength. But here was someone who looked past her defenses, who dared to speak plainly, who wanted her not as a symbol or an achievement, but as a woman. Before she could reply, Jake clapped his hands together. "See? I told you dancing was good for sad people." His innocence cut through the tension, turning it into something softer, healing. Both adults laughed, and Sarah felt the ache in her chest transform into something tender and new. The song shifted, slowing into its final notes. David guided her to a stop, then came around to face her. He knelt, so close she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. "Sarah," he said quietly, as if the moment demanded reverence, "I don't want this to end." Neither did she. And for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to admit it. The applause that followed was small but genuine, rippling through the guests who had gathered to watch. Sarah felt the warmth of it, not as pressure, but as blessing. She had stepped, or rolled, into a space she thought forever closed to her. And she had found not pity, but possibility. As the quartet shifted to another song, David extended his hand once more, not as a question this time, but as an invitation to continue. And with her heart steady and open, Sarah placed her hand in his, ready to dance not just across the floor, but into whatever healing tomorrow might hold. The night air grew softer as the reception carried on, the glow of lanterns shimmering like stars that had descended to rest among the oak trees. Sarah felt strangely lighter, as though something heavy had quietly slipped from her shoulders while she wasn't looking. She had expected this evening to be an ordeal, a parade of polite smiles and carefully hidden loneliness. Instead, she found herself sitting beside David and Jake, the boys' laughter still ringing in her ears, her heart carrying a rhythm that felt suspiciously like hope. They had drifted from the dance floor back to her table, though this time it didn't feel like a place of exile. David pulled up a chair next to her, his presence steady but not intrusive. He had the air of a man who had learned patience the hard way, who knew that silence could sometimes be more healing than words. Jake, of course, had no such restraint. He leaned across the table, eyes shining with curiosity. "Do you ever get scared?" he asked suddenly, his voice small but insistent. David's head turned sharply, as though he might hush his son. But Sarah only smiled, the question striking her not as rude but as honest. She considered before answering, her voice gentle. "Yes," she admitted. "I get scared sometimes. Not so much about my chair, though. I get scared that people will see me as less, or that I'll always be apart from them, no matter how hard I try." The boy nodded with solemnity far beyond his years. "Dad gets scared too. He thinks he's not taking good enough care of me. But I tell him he's wrong. He's the best dad in the whole world." He turned to David with fierce certainty. "You are." The raw truth in the child's words touched something deep in Sarah. She glanced at David and saw his face soften, though his jaw tightened with the effort of containing emotion. He reached over and tousled Jake's hair with a tenderness that spoke of countless nights of comfort, countless mornings of exhaustion and resolve. "Kids are better at healing than adults," Sarah said quietly. "They don't hide what they feel. They don't waste time pretending." David looked at her then, his eyes steady, and in them she saw the shadow of a wound not yet closed. "Jake lost his mother 3 years ago," he said simply. The words landed gently but with weight, like stones placed carefully into her palm. Sarah drew in a breath, understanding more in that moment than he had spoken aloud. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft with sincerity. "She was everything good," David continued, his gaze drifting toward the dance floor where couples still swayed. "Even when she was sick, she kept laughing. She said dancing wasn't about feet, it was about your heart." His lips curved, not in joy, but in memory. "I try to remember that. For him. For me." The ache in his voice mirrored the one Sarah carried in her own chest. 2 different losses, 2 different lives, but the same emptiness left behind. For a long moment, they simply sat in silence, sharing something wordless, their griefs recognizing one another like old friends. And strangely, that recognition felt like healing. Not because the pain was erased, but because it was no longer endured alone. Jake broke the heaviness with the certainty only a child could muster. "I think Mom would like you," he declared, as though that settled something important. "You make Dad smile. He doesn't do that much anymore." David flushed, his gaze flicking to Sarah, then away. But she didn't let him retreat. She met his eyes, steady and unflinching, her voice gentle. "Then I'm glad I'm here tonight." Something passed between them then, something quiet, fragile but alive. It wasn't love. Not yet. Love was too large a word for the beginning of this fragile thread. But it was the seed of something that might grow if nurtured. It was the permission to imagine. Around them, the reception carried on. Champagne poured, laughter rose, children darted between tables. Yet Sarah felt cocooned in a small, private world with this man and his son. The chaos of celebration blurred into background, leaving only the steady warmth of their presence. She found herself speaking words she hadn't planned. "My accident. It took more than my legs. It took pieces of my courage. I built walls to survive. But tonight—" She hesitated, then pressed on. "Tonight feels different. Like maybe those walls don't need to be so high." David's expression softened into something she hadn't seen before. Recognition, gratitude, and a quiet longing. "Maybe walls aren't meant to last forever," he said. Maybe they're just meant to keep us safe until we find someone worth letting in." The truth of his words sank deep, steady and healing, like water soaking into parched ground. Sarah felt her chest loosen, her breath easier. For the first time in years, she wasn't defined by what she had lost. She was defined by the possibility of what she might still find. Jake, oblivious to the depth of what passed between them, tugged at Sarah's hand. "You should come to our house sometime. Meet Buster. He's our dog. He makes pancakes disappear." Sarah laughed, the sound spilling out of her before she could stop it. She turned to David, raising a brow. "World-famous pancakes?" He grinned sheepishly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I may have oversold them once or twice, but they're edible." "They'd better be more than edible," Sarah teased, warmth threading through her tone. "I have very high pancake standards." The sparkle that lit David's eyes in that moment made her heart trip, not with fear but with anticipation. For years she had thought healing meant enduring alone. Tonight she began to wonder if it meant daring to join someone else's mess, daring to laugh, daring to believe that broken things could still be beautiful. And as the night drew on, with Jake's chatter filling the spaces between them and David's quiet strength grounding her, Sarah realized that perhaps the most extraordinary thing of all was how ordinary it felt, how natural, how easy, how alive. The wedding celebration wound down slowly, like a candle flickering in its final glow. Guests began gathering purses and jackets, couples lingering on the dance floor for one last sway, while children, tired from sugar and excitement, leaned sleepily against their parents' shoulders. Yet for Sarah, the night felt far from finished. She sat with David and Jake, and though the world bustled around them, she felt suspended in a quiet sphere of warmth. Jake was still buzzing with energy, his small hands full of crumpled napkins and a flower he had rescued from the centerpiece. He leaned against Sarah's chair as if it were the most natural thing in the world, his presence unburdened and healing. "You should come tomorrow," he announced suddenly, his tone matter-of-fact. "Dad makes pancakes on Sundays. They're kind of famous. And you have to meet Buster. He's the best dog in the universe." Sarah glanced at David, who looked both embarrassed and hopeful. His lips curved into a rueful smile. "Don't let him fool you. They're just regular pancakes." Jake gasped, scandalized. "Dad, they're legendary. Don't ruin it." Laughter spilled out of Sarah, unrestrained and alive. It startled her, how easily it came now, how light it felt in her chest. "Well," she said playfully, "I happen to be an excellent pancake judge. Perhaps I should see for myself." The way David's eyes lit in that moment felt like sunrise. "You'd be welcome," he said, his voice steady, though it carried a thread of wonder, as if he could hardly believe she might actually accept. Sarah held his gaze, letting the silence stretch. In that silence, possibilities bloomed. For years, she had built her life around control, around saying no to anything that might pull her off balance. But tonight, she found herself wanting to say yes, to pancakes, to dogs, to messy kitchens and laughter that echoed through imperfect rooms. To this man and his son, who had cracked open her carefully guarded world. "Yes," she whispered at last. "I'd like that very much." Jake whooped with delight, so loud that several nearby guests turned to smile at the little trio. His joy was infectious, bursting like fireworks in the quiet places of Sarah's heart. She felt something settle inside her, not a dramatic rush of love, but the gentle certainty that healing could begin here with these two. David reached across the table, not in a grand gesture, but simply to rest his hand near hers. His fingers brushed against her knuckles, a small touch that carried more weight than words. "Tomorrow, then," he said, his voice carrying the promise of something both ordinary and extraordinary. As the reception faded, Sarah found herself reluctant to leave. She had dreaded this night, imagining herself a shadow at the edge of joy. Instead, she was going home with flowers in her lap, laughter in her memory, and an invitation that felt like a doorway to something she thought she had lost forever. On the quiet drive back to her apartment, she thought of how sterile her world had become, how the pristine walls and perfect order now seemed more like emptiness than comfort. She pictured Jake's messy energy filling her rooms with drawings and dog hair, David's voice steadying her in the quiet. She realized that healing was not about erasing scars or pretending pain never existed. Healing was about choosing to let someone step into your world and being brave enough to step into theirs. That night, as she placed Jake's rescued flower into a vase on her kitchen counter, her phone buzzed. David's message glowed on the screen. "Thank you for tonight. Jake hasn't stopped talking about you. And honestly, neither have I." Her heart swelled. She typed back, "Thank you for asking me to dance. Thank you for treating me like I was exactly where I belonged. I can't wait to judge those world-famous pancakes." She set her phone down, leaned back in her chair, and closed her eyes. For the first time in 3 years, sleep did not arrive heavy with loneliness. It came softly, sweetly, like a healing hand brushing against her heart. And she drifted off, not as a CEO, not as a survivor, but as a woman who was ready to believe in tomorrow. Because tomorrow there would be pancakes, and laughter, and the possibility of love, and maybe, just maybe, forever. If this story touched your heart, if it brought even a little healing or warmth to your day, I'd love for you to join this journey with me. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment about what part of the story spoke to you most. Your support means the world, and together we can keep sharing stories that bring comfort, love, and hope